Good evening, everybody. I want to very briefly and very rapidly um, review some of what we looked at last week before moving into new material. The concept is Machloket l'shem Shamayim. Machloket l'shem Shamayim means a disagreement for the sake of heaven. And if you study the Talmud, it is a record of disagreements between the sages in the study hall. And in the rabbinic tradition, disagreement is not seen as a bad thing. It's seen, in fact, as a necessary thing. It's almost the fact of disagreement is how truth emerges. And if you go to a Beit Midrash, a study hall in a yeshiva, Talmud is never studied alone. You always have a chavruta, you have a study partner. And ideally, your study partner should be a person who doesn't see things the same way as you do, so that truth will emerge through the encounter of these two perspectives. But a machloket l'shem shamayim means that it is carried on in a respectful manner. And the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot says, "Kol machloket l'shem shamayim sofa lehit kayem," which is a little hard to translate. But a machloket l'shem shamayim will be established, will endure, something like that. Maybe even be resolved. But a machloket that's not l'shem shamayim will not endure, be resolved, however you translate lehit kayem. And then later on in the Talmud, it says that the machloket l'shem, the paradigm of a machloket l'shem shamayim is Hillel and Shammai, right? Because they did disagree respectfully and for the purpose of having the truth emerge, and not simply out of pride or to win. Whereas Korach and his rebellion against Moses and Aaron, that was really for self-aggrandizement. So I want to look briefly at the definition of machloket l'shem shamayim in the sources that we looked at. All right, so these are the four pillars of a machloket l'shem shamayim. 1, listen to the other side and be open to admitting that you might be wrong. 2, check your motivation. Are you trying to win or to understand? Are you trying to win or to solve problems? And here I want to add from my own experience, as I mentioned a few years ago when I was preparing one of my high holiday sermons, I came across this statement in a management journal that said that in the overwhelming percentage of times when you are listening to another person, you're not listening in order to understand what they have to say. You are already in your head preparing your response or your rebuttal as they're speaking. And I was blown away by that, because I realized that is exactly what I do. or exactly what I did up until that point. And I tried to stop doing that. And I think as a result, I've become a better listener because I'm just trying to hear and understand. I'm not trying to respond or rebut. The composition of the response or the rebuttal comes later. Okay, 3, debate the issues without attacking people and harming relationships. And 4, consider that you might both be right despite holding opposite positions. All right, and then we looked at the elephant and rider metaphor, which was developed by Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And Haidt says that our brain has 2 parts. We have the conscious verbal thinking brain, and we have the automatic emotional visceral brain, right? And Haidt compares that to the elephant and the rider. I mean, if you see a guy riding an elephant, right? I mean, superficially, it seems that the rider is in charge, right? But in point of fact, the rider is in charge.
Someone was detected at your back door.
The rider is in charge as long as the elephant lets the rider be in charge, right? And if the elephant decides that the rider's not in charge anymore, the rider is not in charge anymore. And when we react emotionally, viscerally, that's what happens. The elephant takes over, right? So part of the task of trying to have productive and respectful disagreements is to maintain control over your elephant, right? Which is not easy. And if I could give you an example of what I mean by the visceral emotional reaction. So when I was in rabbinical school, and my brother was a freshman in college, and Georgetown was playing Memphis State in Louisville. And my brother, and they were running buses from Georgetown, and my brother was on the bus, and we had made plans to meet in Louisville. But it turned out that at about 3 o'clock in the morning, the bus stopped for a bathroom break and whatever at the bus station in Cincinnati. Right. So my brother called me and he said, I'm actually in Cincinnati. I said, fine, cool. So, stay off the bus and I'll come and pick you up. Okay. And that was Saturday morning. So a few hours later, we went to services at the HUC chapel. And my brother, and you have to understand that my brother dropped out of Hebrew school the day after his bar mitzvah. Okay. And today, as many of you know, because I've spoken about it, he's a Unitarian. Okay. So his Jewish instincts are not well developed, right? But we went to services, and a female classmate of mine, walked in wearing a talit and a kippah, which was normal at HUC. This was in 1983, but it was something that was not. I mean, I don't know how many women were wearing talitot or head coverings at Kehilat Shalom in 1983, but it wasn't. Anyway, so my brother sees this and he's astonished. And he says to me, like in horror, there's a girl wearing a talis and a yarmulke. Even I know that's wrong. right? And, you know, I mean, it's not wrong, right? But the point that he was made, right? I mean, that was a purely emotional, visceral reaction. And if he had, thought about it for, instead of just reacting emotionally, he wouldn't have said that. But that to me is like an example of like the elephant taking over. I mean, no harm, no foul, but in this particular case. All right, so now I want to move on to um, what's known as moral foundations theory. Okay, and this is again developed by Jonathan Haidt. Um, it is not as rooted in Jewish texts as the material that we studied up till now. I mean, Jonathan Haidt is Jewish, and I do think that all of these are rooted in or reflective of Jewish ideals, but they're not, I mean, they're not like rooted in Jewish text as much as the previous material. But it, I mean, the elephant in the rider is a good segue because what Haidt says about these moral foundations are that they're innate. Okay, we all possess them. Um, and but they are malleable, right? That they are malleable, and our life experiences and our learning and our encounter can change the way that we live these moral foundations. Okay. And the thing to bear in mind when we're looking at this is that all of us possess these six moral foundations. However, we tend to prioritize them differently. We don't all prioritize them in the same way. And very often, when there is an argument or a disagreement, if you dig a little bit and try to figure out, you will see that that's exactly right, that it is a clash of moral foundation, right? One side prioritizes one of the foundations, and the other side prioritizes a different moral foundation. Okay, and I will send this stuff out to you, tomorrow morning or so on. But so here are the six moral foundations: care, harm, and each of these is, it means care versus harm, right? This foundation is related to our long evolution as mammals with attachment systems and an ability to feel and dislike the pain of others. It underlies virtues of kindness, gentleness, and nurturance. Okay. And, if there's any questions or whatever, just, jump right in, especially when I'm doing the share screen because I can't see everybody. So if you could be raising your hand and I don't see it. Okay. Fairness versus cheating. This foundation is related to the evolutionary process of reciprocal altruism. It generates ideas of justice, rights, and autonomy. Loyalty versus betrayal. This foundation is related to our long history as tribal creatures able to form shifting coalitions. It underlies virtues of patriotism and self-sacrifice for the group. It is active anytime people feel that it's one for all and all for one. Right? Authority versus subversion. This foundation was shaped by our long primate history of hierarchical social interactions. It underlies virtues of leadership and fellowship, including deference to legitimate authority and respect for traditions. Next, sanctity versus degradation. This foundation was shaped by the psychology of disgust and contamination. It underlies religious notions of striving to live in an elevated, less carnal, more noble way. It underlies the widespread idea that the body is a temple which can be desecrated by immoral activities and contaminants, an idea not unique to religious traditions. And finally, liberty versus oppression. This foundation is about the feelings of reactance and resentment people feel toward those who dominate them and restrict their liberty. Its intuitions are often in tension with those of the authority foundation. The hatred of bullies and dominators motivates people to come together in solidarity to oppose or take down the oppressor. Okay, and first of all, I'll stop here for a second. Any questions or comments or thoughts on this concept and on the six moral foundations?
Well, to bring it back to the rider-elephant dichotomy, would you say that the first characteristic is more kind of the rider's rational side taking charge, whereas the second character after the slash is more the elephant? Is that way to look at it?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, in the sense that we recoil from the second one, right? I mean, right? I mean, nobody, right? I mean,
or the second one takes over. You know, the cheating impulse, for example, takes over.
Right, the cheating impulse takes over, right? And that would be definitely the elephant
Right.
overriding. I mean, we do. I mean, people do this all the time, right? I mean, I know this is wrong. I know I shouldn't do it,
Right.
but I'm doing it anyway, right?
Right.
And that's a good point. I think it is because your elephant has overpowered your rider, right? And your rider is still there saying no, 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 but the elephant is in charge, right?
Right.
So yeah, so that's a good point. I think that's accurate, right? But if you look at any sort of disagreement, you can see where these different foundations might be in opposition one to another. Like, for example, if I think, I mean, again, I mean, this was a long time ago. I wasn't here at the time, but the whole debate about the merger with Shari Torah, right? Which got nasty, right? I mean, there's no doubt that it got nasty. And I think to some extent, you can see, if you look at these foundations, that different sides of the debate prioritize different of these foundations, right? And or in any similar argument, right? An argument about a change in religious practices, right? Well, right, so the people who say no changes, right, they would probably be prioritizing loyalty and authority, right? Where people who favor change might be looking at care and liberty and maybe fairness, right? Depending, on the particular, but let's say, it's a change that gives more, a bigger role to women than they used to have, or something like that, right? Well, so somebody against it would say, that this is, this goes against our tradition, right? And somebody who favors it would say, but this is not fair, right? It's not fair. Conversely, right, the losing side could also claim that the process was was not fair, right? So, all of these, like, obviously we all have all of these foundations at work, but I think some of us, we don't all prioritize them in the same way, right? So I'm not going to, like, the next page asks you to prioritize the 6 foundations. I didn't tell you to bring paper or something to write with. But I would like to, ask everybody to think which of these foundations would be your number one. And again, there's no right or wrong answer, but I admit that it's a challenge. It'd probably take a couple of minutes to come up with, an answer to that. No, come on, anybody.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I was kind of undecided with a couple of them. I mean, living in a democracy, you think of liberty, but I honestly think I would go with fairness because I feel like no matter how much liberty you have or how much care you have, if things aren't going fairly in a relationship or in a country or a civilization, that there's going to be upheaval and there's going to be problems. So I really think fairness, whether it's an administrative fairness or a fairness within a family or a group or society, that it kind of affects everything.
Yeah.
I have an opinion also.
Yeah, please.
I think these dichotomies, this versus that, you can come up with way more than 6, depending on who you are and
Sure.
what you are. And they all get mixed together in everyday life. Yes, I can pick, to me, liberty oppression is the most important, but you can't take it by itself and say, okay, I'm set. I got everything I need. No, yes, you do need all these other things. So they're all
Of course
mixed
you do.
together.
Right,
And
but the point,
which one is a priority to me or anybody else depends on the situation.
right. I absolutely. I mean, I'll give you an example. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I spoke about being Jewish as being part of a nation, part of a people. Um, and for those of you who heard it, I mean, that was purely impromptu. That was not in my notes at all. And I got more passionate than I often get in my sermons, right? And so, I mean, in that particular instance, right, I was prioritizing loyalty betrayal over everything else, right? I mean, which I would say is generally not where I am, right? And I could, make the case that the Jewish kids who are protesting against Israel are prioritizing fairness versus cheating, prioritizing liberty versus oppression, maybe even care versus harm. But in that particular situation, it's clear to me that, I was prioritizing loyalty to my
Mhm.
to my mishpacha, right? Doesn't mean that that's always the foundation that I prioritize. In fact, I would say very rarely is that the foundation that I prioritize. But in that particular case, it was. So no, you're absolutely correct, Len, that, which one you will prioritize will depend on the circumstances. But the point that I want to make is that when you try to unpack a disagreement, very often, and in fact, very easily, you can understand that the two sides of the argument are prioritizing two different foundations. And it, there's not objectively right or wrong. I mean, nobody could say that, like, objectively you should rank them in this order. It's, I would say almost the way we rank them may well be innate. It depends on how much you think your personality is like fixed and not subject to change, and where that comes from.
I'd like to add another comment. The two subjects, as we all know, that you don't discuss at the dinner table, especially Thanksgiving, are politics and religion. Why is that? The elephant is in charge in both of those things, 99%. In my personal experience, whichever side you're on, it's the elephant that drives it.
Mm-hmm.
It just does.
Yeah.
And the problem is people don't realize it. They think they're being purely rational when in fact the elephant is telling them what to do.
Right. All right, Toby, I think I saw
Yeah,
your
I
line.
think that the care harm is really an element of all of these because your decision is going to be partly where is the harm in doing this and taking this stand, and how much is the care really a part of it. And also, I think you're giving short shrift to the elephant because the elephant really doesn't think the same way as a human being. Maybe I'm being too literal, but I don't know if that's such a good comparison. Because
Well, no, I mean, obviously, we're not talking about, like, we're all riders and elephants, right? The point is that when the elephant takes over, right? I mean, like I said at the beginning, right? The rider is in charge to the extent that the elephant agrees to let the rider be in charge. It's a metaphor. It's not meant
right, I
literally.
understand.
Yeah. Okay. So who's left? We have Joe and D.
Yeah, I think I identify more with care and harm. Though I understand the argument about fairness, certainly.
Yeah, well, they're all important. I mean, it's
Yeah,
not like,
yeah.
And it's just a question of like prioritizing one over another. Yeah, D.
I can't, I kind of have pieces of what everybody has said that I agree with, but I can't come to one. I'm very much care and harm and fairness and cheating. And, but it always comes down to a word that's not used in any of these, and that's, or two. One is trust and one is respect. And I think that both of those words fall in almost every one of these categories, because when I think about the things that I get very emotional about, whether it's openly or privately, there's always something in the back of my mind that has to do with somebody's motives. And if I think, looking at some of the words here, if I think that the person, if I think that if I hear something from a person that I don't agree with, but I have a great deal of respect or trust, I'm much more willing to try to find a connection with that perception. And much more open-minded to listen to something that either I've never heard before or that I don't normally believe. But if I doubt somebody's motives as being hurtful to others, everything goes out the window.
Okay, it's fair. I mean, I would say for me, I come down to liberty, oppression, and fairness cheating. And I'm not sure that I could prioritize, frankly, after I asked you to prioritize one, I'm not sure that I could prioritize one of those two over the other. I think that may be contextual. But those are the two that I think motivate me the most. Although again, it depends on the situation and the context. Okay, so now what I want to,
Rabbi, just before you,
yeah,
could you go back to the original? Yeah, now you just, okay, now you just sparked something. And I think what I'm trying to say, though I don't change the ones that were important to me, I think when I look at your selection of liberty and oppression, I think it contains the thoughts that I was trying to express.
say more.
Can you go back?
Yeah, hold on. I have to. I just quickly have to adjust the volume in the headset because the air conditioner just went on and it.
Okay. Well, I don't know that what I'm trying to say is that profound, but there was something in.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Something in people feel towards those who dominate them and restrict their liberty, the hatred of bullies and dominators, and motivation. All of those things are parts of the two that I picked. And I think that goes back to something that Len was saying. I think you could just pick out key words from each of these and make a whole new bullet that would subsume all of them. Take a little bit of drafting, but I think you could.
All right, so I want to move on to something that actually this was the basis of my discussion on the second day of Rosh Hashanah a couple of years ago. But that was without the background of having discussed the different moral foundations. So I'd like to read it and get your take on it again. Okay. I mean, some of you may remember, oh yeah, we did this. All right. There once was a good man, a religious man, an Orthodox man. He spent his entire life helping sick people receive the medical treatment they needed. He didn't care if they were good people or bad people. He didn't care if they were men or women, Jewish or Muslim, religious or secular. So this takes place in Israel. He looked after anyone who needed help because he saw that this was what he had to do as a religious man. One day, he began organizing his annual fundraising event and succeeded in getting all sorts of pop stars to perform on stage. Lots of pop stars meant lots of donations. Lots of donations meant even more sick people receiving the care they required. The good man was delighted. Publicity was sent far and wide. But with the publicity out, all could see that every single pop star on the bill was a man. It was almost as if women were being kept away from the stage deliberately. And it turned out that they were. The good man was a religious man, an Orthodox man. And just as his Orthodox values led him to blessed charity work, his values also held that women should not sing in front of men. Everyone told the good man that he could not have a public event that refused to let any women on stage. It would be like saying that women don't matter. But the good man's supporters knew that it would be crazy to expect him to ignore his religious beliefs when raising money for a charity built on those beliefs. Gradually, one by one, the artists began pulling out of the event. They said they were happy to perform, but only if women could perform too. But the good man could not agree to host an event that undermined his own values. Everything was at a knife edge. Would an event take place that consciously and deliberately excluded women? Or alternatively, would the event be canceled, ensuring that far fewer people would be helped by the man who wished to help them? The argument had only just begun. Okay, so let's go back up to that. And what are the moral foundations that are in tension?
Would one of them be authority?
Yeah, well, I mean, don't ask me. I mean,
I think one of them would be authority because he was seeking to follow the religious, tenets that would be, the authority that he would follow.
right.
And loyalty because he was also loyal to following the, the Orthodox standards that he wanted to follow.
Right. And what about the performers who said, I can't perform at a concert that doesn't permit women? I mean, what are their moral foundations?
I guess they were looking at fairness.
Fairness, yeah.
Right.
And
Fairness.
you might say they were looking at authority too, but maybe a different, like suppose they were Reform Jews, where they were used to, egalitarian ways of doing things. So that would kind of be their ruling authority.
Right. I mean, that's an important point. I mean, it's like, when I worked for Hillel, right, that there was generally a rule that preference yields to conviction, right? So that, any food served by Hillel should be kosher, right? Because there are people who, their conviction says they can't eat non-kosher food, right? Whereas nobody says, oh, I can't eat kosher food, right? I mean, I have a moral or religious conviction that I cannot eat kosher food. I prefer lobster, okay, but that's a preference, that's not a conviction, right? But then when it got to like services in a small Hillel that couldn't support multiple minyanim, right? So originally it said, well, then it should, have a mechitza and only count women. But then the response was, well, but other people have convictions too. It's not in this case conviction versus preference. It's conviction versus conviction, right? So definitely. I mean, and it's made more complicated, frankly, by the fact that this is taking place in Israel. And by the way, this is a true story. because the Orthodox rabbinic establishment is frankly so oppressive that many secular Israelis feel like a moral duty to do whatever they can to undermine it. So, that becomes, whereas, in America, I mean, I would never go to a Chabad function and expect that women would be allowed to sing, right? But I know that, and it's my choice to go or not to go. It's not, it carries a different valence in Israel than it does here, right? So anybody else in terms of the foundations that are at play or in opposition?
I'm noticing that these dichotomies or axes are being thrown out the window. People are taking the first word, but the second word has no meaning. For example, on the matter of should women be there or not, most people would say that's an issue of fairness, sure. But what's cheating got to do with it? That axis is meaningless. That's why, that's what I suggested, that these are just arbitrary. It could be anything. The
Well,
issue
look,
is
I mean,
fairness versus not fairness versus cheating.
correct. I mean, in this particular case, I mean, look, this is Haight's work. It's not mine. I don't, but I agree. Frankly, I think that the second part of each axis is kind of useless.
Right, I too.
That's what I'm saying.
Me too.
Yeah. I mean, although in this particular case, the liberty versus oppression, because again, I would, and all the more so if I'm a woman, a female performer, experience it as oppression that I cannot participate in this concert, right? But on the other hand, the good man would say that, if you want to force me to allow women to sing at an event that I'm organizing, I'm the one being oppressed, right? I mean, and similarly, right? I mean, he could say that you are subverting, my religious convictions. So, but in general, I do agree with you that that the second word is often superfluous.
And what I've noticed, for example, the Myers-Briggs personality test and everything, when anybody sets up these axes, they're arbitrary, and you just can't pin down the human mind and the human spirit in terms of simple axes. Nobody gets that right.
Well,
Right. Go ahead.
It's an opinion.
well, that, that prevails in your point, Len, prevails in a lot of situations where I hate to say anything and everything because I don't want to quantify it, but almost everything I can think of that when I say man now, I'm using it in the umbrella that any human creates has some degree of subjectivity. So that automatically makes it less than perfect, however you try to quantify something. But what makes it difficult for me is that if I understand, going back to what you talked about in your Drosh, Rabbi, a couple of weeks ago, and then in the first round of this conversation, the idea that stuck with me was still going back to the words that stick in my mind about you actually laid it at our doorstep in terms of describing part of what's going on in the congregation historically. And it seems to me that we're not going to be able to do the ideal of what's necessary to get to the ideal until we get to this idea of trust and mutual respect It's much, much easier to have a difference of opinion, however passionate, with somebody that you like or somebody at least that you respect, than somebody that you, starting from the beginning, distrust and don't want anything to do with, but you got to deal with the argument. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but I think that's part of what keeps people apart instead of moving them together. Much easier to say, I screwed up and made a mistake, I'm really sorry, if you care about that person,
Sure.
as opposed to some objective problem-solving end you're trying to get to. My comments are not intended to contradict anything that's being said. I'm just thinking.
No, I get that, but you know, to a certain extent, I mean, I have just, you know, had that precise discussion, you know, where I've often said to people, you know, an apology doesn't even mean that you acknowledge that you are wrong.
Right.
It means you are prioritizing the relationship over
The issue.
being right.
Right. You said that to me. Yes.
Yeah. Right. And some people are not capable of that. I mean, you know, I had a extensive discussion with somebody in our congregation who was not participating in this tonight. And I said exactly that, you know, she said, but I didn't do anything wrong. And I said, I get that you think you didn't do anything wrong. And I might even agree with you. Okay. But this other person feels that they were wronged. And if you apologize, it means you are prioritizing the relationship over the principle. And impossible. Never happened. I just could not make that happen, which is very frustrating to me. You know, because I find myself apologizing constantly, even though I'm never wrong, because the relationships matter more, you know, more than the principle. All right, so now, so now that we've read this story and we've looked at the different moral foundations that could be at work here, what do you think should happen? And again, this is a true story.
I think that the religious man should bend to the needs of the community he's trying to serve by saying that it would be okay for women to come.
Well, it's not that they couldn't come; they couldn't
or right,
perform. Yeah,
perform.
right.
Maybe that's asking too much of him. But that, to me, he would get the effect he wanted to help the people he was concerned about.
Right,
I agree with Toby, because I think that the welfare of all of the people he was trying to help, you know, was more important than just his personal feelings. It's you know, the group that he's helping involves more people than just his own particular beliefs.
right. But I'm playing devil's advocate here, okay? Because what you are saying is essentially, you know, this guy should forfeit his principles, forfeit his principle in order to raise money to help people, right? But he could say the same thing, right? That these performers should forfeit their principle in order to raise money for people who need it, right? I mean, it's like, I mean, let me say two things. It's not self-evident to me that this guy is any more or less unreasonable than the performers who wouldn't perform. Having said that, my values are those of the performers and not of this guy, right? So it's easy for me to say, well, he should just, give it up for one night, right? Because I'm telling him to give up a principle that not only do I not share, but I actually find repugnant. So it's easy for me to ask him to make that sacrifice, right? And much harder for me to ask the performers to make that sacrifice because I agree with them. I share their perspective.
Rabbi, though, I have a question. So if he is Orthodox, and he is looking at, all of the mitzvah and things like that, wouldn't, in the grand scheme of things, a mitzvah of helping many people come above the prohibition of singing with women? Like, wouldn't one be a higher tenet to focus on?
That is a great question. And the answer from his perspective, not mine, would be no, okay? Because this whole thing, it's very interesting. I mean, it's fascinating, right? This is called Kol Isha, okay? The voice of a woman. But the full phrase is Kol Isha Be'erva, which basically means the voice of a woman is lewdness, okay? That the idea, why can't men hear women singing? Okay, because it is
And discuss.
What?
Because I think it has the same thing to do with why men and women aren't supposed to sit together, because it's distracting, and actually I'm quoting a Chabad rabbi who said it's really a compliment. I don't accept it. I found it to be very interesting that women have far more self-control than men. And so for the sake of both, they are kept separate.
Right, but it's not just that it's distracting, it's seductive, okay?
Well, that's what I meant. I didn't know.
Right. I mean, there's no reverse mitzvah. Women can hear men sing.
Right.
Okay, on that whole basis that women have more self-control and whatever. Okay, but see, so when you talk about like pikuach nefesh, saving a life, right? And that overrides everything except murder, spilling innocent blood, or sexual immorality. Okay, and from his and to us that might simply mean, right, cheating on your spouse or whatever, right? But from his perspective, a man hearing a woman sing is in fact sexual immorality. So it doesn't override. I mean, again, I'm explaining a perspective that I do not remotely share. Okay, but from his perspective, yeah, I mean, pikuach nefesh does not, in fact, override this. Which didn't really occur to me until you asked the question. But that's why it's, it is a conflict that's almost impossible to resolve, right? And like, bottom line, by the way, the concert didn't take place, right? It didn't take place. All of the performers pulled out and it didn't happen.
So that's a testimony to the passion of the perspective or the value or whatever you want to describe that each side had. So it became an irresolvable conflict.
Right, right. Absolutely. And it's not, you know, and the point is that, look, sometimes, you know, even within our community, we may have a conflict that can't be resolved, right? But it's too easy to say that, you know, I'm good, the people on the other side are bad, right? I want what's best for the shul, they want what's best for them, right? I want what's best for the country, they want what's best for the wealthy, or they want what's best for minorities, you know, whatever. Um, and, you know, we often like find ourselves in that situation, right? Where, you know, either we're good and the other side is bad, or we're acting according to principle, they're acting according to
Power.
power or some irrational thing. But very often, I mean, and so I guess what I'm saying here is that, you know, the idea of Machloket l'shem Shamayim, right, and the idea of trying to understand the moral foundations at play doesn't always mean that you can resolve the disagreement,
All right.
right? I mean, even in the Talmud, right, there are a number of disagreements that are simply not resolved, okay, because they can't be. You know, that's the real reason why we have Elijah's cup, by the way. It's not it's not for Elijah. It's because there's a dispute whether there should be 4 cups or 5 cups. Okay, and that dispute in the Talmud is not resolved. Okay, so the resolution is we'll have the 5th cup, but we won't drink it. Okay, and then how does it become associated with Elijah? Because the Talmud tells us that those, I think it's 11, but don't hold me to it, but whatever small number of disputes that are never resolved in the Talmud, when Elijah comes, he'll resolve them. Okay, so that's how that 5th cup became associated with Elijah. But that's the real reason that we have a 5th cup at the Seder, because it was a dispute that was not resolved, right? Similarly, the reason that the mezuzah is on a slant, okay, because there's a dispute. This is actually post-Talmudic between Rashi and his grandsons, whether the mezuzah should be upright or horizontal.
Oh,
And so it's at an angle to, you know, because it's not decided.
This can't be
But-
resolved because the issue is which is more important, the principles of the man or the principles of the performer to them. Each
Right.
one will say that's bedrock. I can't yield on it, and you just can't resolve it. You just cannot. And none of us are orthodox, so you're right, Rabbi. We're inclined to say, hey, he should bend. But if you're orthodox, no, you will not have that opinion.
Correct.
Orthodoxy rests on certain rules that they follow, and we don't follow many of those rules, but they do. So their whole system depends on it. But is that
Right.
important? Is that less important, more important than people who say there should be women on there? You can't resolve it. It just cannot be resolved.
No, you can't. You can't. And particularly, look, I mean, there are things that can be compromised, right? There are things that can be compromised, but the minute you understand that from the perspective, and by the way, not all Orthodox people observe this, but from the perspective of those who do, this is seen as a subset of sexual immorality. And then it really is irresolvable. I mean, it's not like, you know, do you have to wait 6 hours or 3 hours after eating meat to have dairy, right? So somebody who normally wait 6 hours could, in extenuating circumstances, only wait 3. Okay, but there is no extenuating circumstance which would permit this, and quite literally, you should allow yourself to be killed rather than permit this, because it, you know, from their perspective, it's a matter of sexual immorality. Okay, any last thoughts?
Rabbi, I just have a question. When you mentioned about the mezuzah, so before the rabbis started, discussing this, how did people usually, were they just some of them straight up and some of them sideways, or like, is there any information about that?
He wasn't there, he doesn't know.
No, I mean, no, that's a good question. And I mean, the answer I would guess is no. I mean, there are very ancient buildings in Israel where the niche for the mezuzah is still there, but I don't know if that's like earlier than this. I honestly don't know. I mean, I would say clearly it's not settled. Okay, it wasn't settled, because if it was settled, right, instead of having this dispute, you'd have an explanation of why it is this way versus the other way. But beyond that, I don't really have an answer.
Thank you.
All right. Night, folks.
Good night.
Night.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
Shabbat shalom,
Thanks.
everybody.
Good night.
Shabbat shalom.